Hey everyone, today's video is a little bit different than usual. As you can see, my surroundings are very different. That's because I'm in my bedroom and today is Christmas Eve. I still want to bring you a video though. I'm so excited to compare these two cameras. This here is the Sony a5100 and this is the Sony a5000. Now these two cameras look very similar, but there are some differences between them just cosmetically as well. Let's just start off, let's hop right into it. The Sony a5000, it has more metal accents, whereas the a5100 is more fully blacked out. For example, I'll just come closer and show you here. On the a5000, you see this metal ring which goes around the lens mount. Personally, I think that's a really nice touch. As well, here on the shutter button, we see that, well, it's silver as well. It's got this metal look to it. Now, if we compare that to the a5100, we see that it is a lot more black here. This mount over here is fully black. It's still metal, but it's black. And then same thing with the shutter button here. Mine is a little bit scratched up, but it is fully black as well. Another difference between these two cameras is the grip. If you take a look closely, you see that this has like a leather or a leatherette type grip, whereas on the a5000 over here, you have more of this perforated type grip. It's got like little tiny holes. Personal preference, honestly, there's no difference between the two in terms of actual usability. It's just what you think looks better. You know, honestly, if I had to decide between these two cameras, which one looks better, I would actually give it to the Sony a5000. I think it's just got a little bit more character and it just looks more, I don't know. I just think it looks better. That's not to say that the a5100 is a bad looking camera. They're both really interesting. They both look really cool. And it's pretty interesting that they can house a full APS-C size sensor in here and it looks this tiny. One other thing to note is the plastic on the a5100 has more of a texture, whereas on the a5000 it's more of a smooth plastic. I don't think this is something you'd be able to see on video, you just have to see it in real life. But here's the a5000, and here is the a5100. I don't think it's something that you can see on video. Now moving on from that, let's talk about the actual usability of this camera. Now both of them pretty much have buttons in exactly the same position. There is no difference between any of that. You've got the zoom rocker at the top, you've got a record switch, photo, power switch. All of these buttons on the back are identical. The only usability difference between these two is the fact that the a5100 has a touch screen and the a5000 does not. Now about that touch screen, Sony did an absolutely terrible job implementing it on specifically this camera. Their later models like the Sony a7R5, fantastic touchscreen. You can navigate through the whole entire menu system with it. So thumbs up there. But for this camera, all you could do is initiate tracking. That's it. Even when it comes to moving the focusing point, like if you want to have center autofocus point and then move that focus point around, you can't do that. It's only to set the focus to tracking, and then it will follow whatever you tapped on. For the kinds of stuff that I do, I don't really value that feature that much. So for me, the touchscreen doesn't really matter, but if you really want to do focus tracking, that is a benefit of having a touchscreen here. So now let's get into some of the specs. Now the Sony a5100 has a 24 megapixel sensor. For the a5000, it's a 20 megapixel sensor. That doesn't really matter that much for video. I mean, the megapixels is more for the photo end of things, so it doesn't really matter. For video, the a5100 records 1080p at 60 frames per second, whereas this does 1080i at 60. Now what is 1080i? Like, what's the difference between 1080p and 1080i? Basically, slow motion is going to be much lower quality versus if it was actually shot in 1080p. This effectively, if shooting interlaced 60 frames per second, is shooting 1080p at 30 frames per second. Because what 60i does is it reads half of the lines on the sensor in one frame, and then the second frame has the second half of those lines. So you basically have half the resolution for all of your slow motion clips, or you can just squish it down to 30 frames per second, combine those two different scan lines to one clip, and then you effectively have 30 frames per second on here at full 1080p. So the Sony a5100 also has the XAVC-S codec, which this camera, the a5000, does not. This camera only shoots AVC HD. Basically, XAVC-S is a newer codec and it's just containing a little bit more information in the video which you can work with in post. So if you want to do a lot of heavy color grading or you want to do any other kind of post-processing to the clip, XAVC-S would be a lot easier for that than AVC HD. Now, all of that jargon sounds really complicated. Simply put, professionals could really value the slightly better codec of XAVC-S, and professionals could also benefit from having non-interlaced video on the a5100. If you don't know what any of that means, you're probably better off with the a5000 because this will still provide footage that you'll be totally happy with on your YouTube channel or whatever you want to use this for. It still has incredible quality and you will not be disappointed. I just wanted to quickly mention one thing. People online say that the Sony a5100 has an overheating problem and that the a5000 does too, but it's to less of an extent. I modified both of these cameras so that they don't have a record limit. They basically record indefinitely, and I put a full battery into them and let them record all the way through. Neither of the cameras overheated. The condo, I had it set to 22.5 degrees Celsius. So if you're doing some kind of like podcast type situation, I didn't have any problem with that. And then just for fun, I had it as a B cam for a podcast that I filmed, and absolutely not a problem whatsoever. So I just wanted to put that out there. It is a problem for some people, but for me, I didn't really run into any issues with that, so I can't really speak on behalf of that. Okay, so let's get to the real juicy stuff. I'm sure you want to actually see how these cameras compare to each other. So what I did is I put both of these cameras on auto mode. I didn't do anything special in terms of framing or whatever. I just shot the cameras as they were. Just let the camera do its thing. Basically, I just shot the way that I think someone who's looking to get into photography would shoot. That way you can have an idea of what kind of footage you'll get out of this camera. I also only shot it with the kit lenses which are included with these two cameras. Of course, now you could put cinema glass on here because it has the Sony E mount. You could put like absolutely crazy lenses. You could pop it into manual mode, shoot at 24 frames per second, 1/50th for the shutter speed, you know, create a crazy cinematic look with both of these cameras. But I'm not doing that for the purpose of this video because most likely if you're looking at this camera, you're just starting out and you're looking for something that you can eventually grow into. Super quick before I show you those videos, I just want to say that's not to say that professionals can't use this camera. I've actually used this camera on a few of my professional shoots just to see, you know, if I can. And I sent it to some pretty big clients. So my biggest client is a hotel and water park brand here in Niagara Falls. I did a full event shoot with this camera over here and they didn't know a thing. They were super happy with the results, and honestly, that's all that matters. If you can get good results with your camera, then it is a professional camera. All right, now let me show you those test videos that I did between these two cameras, and you can be the judge of which you prefer, and then I'll share my thoughts after. Let's take a look. Alright, so personally between these two cameras, I have to give it to the Sony a5100 for video. Just a slight edge just because I'm a professional and it has some more features that a professional would prefer. You also have slightly better low light in terms of its ISO. But honestly, for 90% of people, I would actually recommend the Sony a5000. It's a little bit cheaper on the used market than the a5100, and you get really close in terms of quality. Now, if you give it enough light, you put a good lens on there and you're not shooting slow motion, you could literally shoot a movie with this thing. One thing I noticed between these two cameras is that the Sony a5100 actually shot everything just a slight bit warmer. There's nothing wrong with that. You can of course change the white balance on your own and make it as warm or cool as you'd like, but that's just one thing to note. Straight out of the box, this is slightly warmer. So as my final notes, I would recommend the Sony a5000 unless you specifically need 60 frames per second or you know you're going to be shooting a lot of low light. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to give it a thumbs up and check out some of my other videos. I do a lot of cool little comparisons. I do a lot of camera related content. If you're interested, be sure to subscribe. I'll see you guys next time. Ciao.